Welcome to the first lecture in the Chapter 10 series. In this chapter, we are going to be breaking down the different relationship types that are most common for interpersonal communication. So we'll be talking about communication in friendships, romantic relationships, family relationships, and coworker relationships. Each of those relationship types will coincide with its own mini lecture. So in this lecture, we are going to start by talking about communication in friendships. So concerning friendships, some of the things that we are going to be looking at in this lecture are specific to the characteristics of friendships and how those characteristics map onto some of the communication concepts that we've already talked about. So the first characteristic of friendship is that friendships have a lifespan. And in this discussion, we are going to be framing it in Rollins's 6 stages of friendship. And so in our earlier chapter 9, we talked about the different stages of relational development. And we're really going to parallel that discussion here and look at some of these specific stages that are representative of friendship development. So while the earlier stages kind of talked about relationships in general, here we're really going to be focusing on the specific relationship of friendship. So the first stage is called role limited interaction. And this is where we see individuals interacting for the first time. Again, these interactions follow social and cultural norms. They're fairly civil, fairly polite. We're not sharing a lot of personal information yet. This stage really is representative of the initiating stage that we saw in the earlier model of relationship development. The second stage is friendly relations. In this stage, we see conversations becoming more friendlier. We're beginning to share a little bit more information about ourselves. We might share stories and anecdotes. This is really kind of the invitation for friendship. So if we go back to that predicted outcome theory, role-limited interactions would determine, kind of be that first interaction. And if the interaction was positive or negative, that would determine whether we move into this friendly relation stage. So really thinking about that kind of the second, third, fourth potential interactions where we're beginning to get to know that person a little bit better and trying to determine if we want to become better friends with them. Again, this stage really is representative of the experimenting stage that we saw in the earlier stage model of relationship development. In the friendship model, the third stage is moves towards friendship, and this is really where interactions become more like what you would think of that you have with your friends here on campus or are from home, and think of in your own kind of social networks. Interactions begin to become less bound by norms and begin to be kind of more social, more dictated by the relationship. You begin to have a lot more information about the other person and how they kind of interact and their preferences. You might begin to have like kind of shared anecdotes. You might even begin in this stage to share some of that depth. So if we go back to the social penetration model, increasing your breadth of topics, but also potentially letting on into some depth in the inner parts of your identity and self-concept. And if that goes well, then you'll move into nascent friendship. So really, this stage is when we begin to think of the other person as a friend. We begin to disclose more personal information. Interactions become less bound by kind of social norms. We'll still talk a little bit later in this lecture that it's still guided by rules of friendship, but a little bit less politeness here. We begin to really kind of show our true colors in these two stages. And if we look at moves towards friendship and nascent friendship, this is really together, these two stages represent the intensifying stage in that earlier model that we talked about in chapter 9. The bonding, or the kind of integrating and bonding stages from the earlier models are represented in this model by stabilized friendship. So this is when friendship is fully established. We have high levels of trust. We really, we're kind of considering that person like a very close friend. Maybe we'll term them like our best friend. But this is really where we see pretty stabilized friendship. And so the last stage in this model, the sixth stage, really discusses something that we didn't talk about in the earlier models, stage model, but we did talk about when we talked about kind of terminating friendship in chapter 9, so the end of relationships. And this is waning friendship. So we know that friendships are unique from other relationships because they're mostly not permanent. There are no legal ties. They change pretty, maybe fairly often throughout the lifespan. So as you think about maybe the major turning points in your life, your friendships may have changed. So if you moved, or if you when you came to college, you gained new friends. Maybe some of your old other friends become less relevant in your personal life. And so thinking about this stage is represented in waning friendship. A similar attribute of friendships is that friendships, unlike romantic relationships, you don't really often have a breakup moment. I'm terminating an interaction where you would terminate the friendship. More often than not, friendships drift apart. You kind of maybe disclose less to that person. You see them not very often. Maybe you moved away. You might still consider people in your life that once were friends, friends, but not your best friend, or a friend, but I don't see them very often. So again, friendships very rarely have this kind of ending. We don't talk about ex-friends like we do ex-romantic partners. Friendships can decline for a variety of reasons. One is that maybe you just begin to not like each other. So especially during kind of the adolescent, emerging adult years, when your self-concept and your identity is changing quite rapidly, you might just find that you no longer have the same interests as the other person, or maybe their personality traits are no longer in line with your personality traits. And so you may just kind of drift apart over time. You also might find life circumstances resulting in waning friendship. So thinking about maybe physical separation, changes in life circumstances. So in addition to that drifting apart or having kind of a lack of maintenance behaviors, you might have actual events like moving to college where you're physically separated from your friend, which limits the interactions that you may have, or makes maintenance a lot more effortful. And you also may have changes in your life circumstances, like when you get married or you have a baby. And so thinking about those life circumstances, if your friends aren't going through that with you, you might find other people who are going through similar experiences and can relate on that level. So here we see 6 stages of how friendships kind of develop that maps a little bit onto what we've already talked about in the general stages of relational development, but adding a few extra stages, elaborating on that intensifying stage, as well as adding waning friendship. So thinking about kind of how friends drift apart and for what reasons that may happen. So looking at some of the other characteristics of friendship, we know that friendships are voluntary. We are able to choose our friends, and they get to choose as well whether they want to be in that relationship. Unlike some relationships like family relationships, so we think about, you can't choose your family. As adults, you can choose how much time you want to interact with them, but thinking about that blood relation, you can't change that. But your friends, you do choose. You can select, to remain friends with them or not. But we do know that selections of friend relationships are not arbitrary. So if we go back to attraction theory, we can think about things like proximity. We can think about similarity and complementarity that would really that influence how we select the people that we want to be friends with. And we also need to maintain those friendships. So just because we want to be friends with somebody doesn't mean that that relationship is going to endure. We have to work at it, we have to choose it, and we have to continue to maintain that relationship as it moves on. And we do that voluntarily. We also know that friendship relationships are most often characterized by our peers. This means that the friendship relationship is often characterized by equal power distribution. So thinking that, your friend doesn't have some sort of authority or power over you. Now, this can get a little blurry if we think about certain contexts like friendships that develop in the workplace where you may actually have a power distance, and we'll talk about some of that when we talk about in the fourth lecture for chapter 10, workplace relationships. But really thinking about how that equal power and authority functions in the different communicative behaviors that we've talked about. So things like forming the relationship and maintaining the relationship, navigating the rules of the relationship. We'll talk in the next final chapter about conflict, and that really is as power has a really important place there as well. And so when we think about the interactions with our peers, even something as simple as decision making, we know that both people generally have equal say in how the relationship and how decisions are made in the relationship because of that egalitarian power differential. And fourthly, we know that friendships differ by sex. And so in the research, we generally classify friendships into same-sex and opposite-sex friendships. So same-sex friendships would include woman-to-woman friendships, as well as male-to-male friendships, and opposite-sex friendships are classified as a female to male. Thinking solely on biological sex here. So much of this research is determined by that classification and not necessarily looking into gender roles and sexual orientation, which we know from chapter 2 are really important, but unfortunately very rarely make its way into understanding some of the dynamics in the relationships and friendship relationships and classifications here. But that's just something to think about as we think about same-sex relationships. How might sexual orientation influence that? Or opposite-sex relationships, how might the preferred gender roles influence some of the interactions and the generalizations that we make about these specific relationship types. So in that vein, looking at strictly biological sex, we know that same-sex friendships, there are some differences, much like we talked about in chapter 2, in how things like relational maintenance, how kind of rapport building and building closeness are enacted in those relationships. We know that women tend to build friendships through shared conversation, and men tend to build friendships through shared activities. But this doesn't necessarily mean that the levels of closeness are different in these relationships. So men and women report equal levels of closeness, satisfaction, happiness in their same-sex relationships, even though they're building those relationships in different ways. When we think about opposite sex friendships, we think about some of the advantages for opposite sex friendships. So thinking about being friends with a member of the opposite sex offers a new, perhaps different perspective on things like dating, on understanding members of the opposite sex. They may be able to provide opportunities for men to be more emotional and expressive, and for women to engage in new kind of activity building kind of rapport in the relationship. We also know that opposite sex friendships may provide opportunities for expanding one's social network. So when you think about, how do you meet people, of the opposite sex, it could be through these shared opposite sex friendships that we have. Some interesting things that exist within opposite sex friendships would be kind of the degree to which physical or romantic attraction may influence or affect that friendship. So the age-old question of can men and women truly be friends without any kind of physical or romantic attraction eventually occurring? Can they truly be an opposite sex platonic friendship? Is one that you will explore in your class discussion for this chapter. So thinking about some of the potential interesting areas here as we think about understanding opposite sex friendships. That's something that you'll explore in that activity. The final characteristic of friendship is that friendships are governed by rules. So as you may expect, certain things, we come to expect certain things from our friends. We expect friends to behave in a specific way. This is often also communicated through pop culture rhetoric, and so a lot of these rules are culturally bound. They're often they can be explicitly said in a friendship, but often are implicitly or implied rules. So thinking about, what are some expectations that you have for your friends? You expect them to be loyal, you expect them to be honest, you expect them to make time for you. So those are some of the common rules of friendship, and so we can think about potentially how rules of friendship can change, whether it's a same-sex or opposite-sex relationship, and thinking about how they change over the lifespan. And so that's something that I want you to discuss in this lecture with your peers now. So that concludes what we are going to discuss in this lecture for Chapter 10 on friendship.